Good morning, party people. We are, as you can see, doing something a little different here. I am presenting in dark mode, so to speak. I was turning on my setup this morning and I was like, oh, you know what? I have really nice cameras. I can kind of shoot in the dark. So why don't I do that? And it'll be a little weird if I have to switch over to camera one, the one where I do transparency overlays when I'm like talking in front of SQL Server. The quality on that won't be quite as good because it relies on the green screen stuff. But I'm like, oh, I should just, do like this because this is what I would code like. There is a light around the back side of the monitor that kind of opens up the room a little bit or lightens up the room a little bit. But otherwise, we'll just kind of see the sunrise gradually here. Will he tell us a story to make us sleep? Liz, it's so true story. When Erica and I first started dating, she was like, she would ask me questions when we were going to sleep. She's like, so how did you get started with the internet and stuff like that? And I would tell her stories from my computer lab days at the University of Houston, and it would knock her out like every time. I wouldn't even have to get 5 minutes into telling her about how the internet works or how some tech topic works, and she would be out like a light. Good morning, G Surgeon from the Netherlands. And I saw Mossy Moss is in here as well. Oh, my mom's here. My mom from Cynthia Hines is over on Facebook. She's my mom, so hi, Mom. She and I both get up really early in the morning, so it usually works out that we can email each other. Tell us the one about the management studio team using the data can. I don't think I've ever had someone from the Microsoft in the audience when I've told that story either. But because I tell a lot of my stuff in person when we do in-person sessions, and that one I don't think I've ever used that joke in front of Microsoft people. I think they'd get kind of pissed off. I mean, Microsoft people get kind of pissed off at me regardless for most of them, except Adam Saxton, Patrick LeBlanc. I mean, there are people who, probably because they don't work on the SQL Server team. Telnet. There's only one L in Telnet, Richie. I'm disappointed. You should know better. Oh, Havitigalur, good to see you as well. I'm working on, so this weekend I'm working on shipping my stuff to Iceland. We're like trying to set out the shipping of our car and all our furniture goods and all that, get quotes on it for shipping it over to Iceland from here. So it's kind of neat to see how that works. Because I'm so excited. I just found out this week that the instant that my residence permit gets approved, we can go straight over there. We had thought that there were some dates that we had to meet for, like it was going to be 3 or 4 months in advance that we had to get the permit and everything, but it worked out really well. Good morning. So let's see here. So let's hop into the questions because Rebecca had one that I didn't get to yesterday from Facebook, and it was a really good question. So as a reminder too for folks, these are open technical questions about Microsoft SQL Server. Just only post your question once. Surly Dev is our heroic moderator who helps manage copying the questions around and queuing them up for me. So, yes, ship them to New Hampshire. Yes, but that's not quite as much fun for me. So Rebecca asked over on Facebook, why do people still recommend isolating TempDB on virtual machines? If it's just a big pool of storage, who cares if TempDB is on its own drives? And there are actually several reasons, and they're going to depend on the make and model of storage that you have. So first up, if you're doing SAN snapshots, if you're doing SAN snapshots for backups or VM snapshots for backups, you don't want to hassle with snapping TempDB. It just doesn't even make any sense. It doesn't make sense to waste space for TempDB inside your backups. So in that, if you put TempDB on a different volume, you can coordinate with your snapshot backup software to make sure that they don't bother keeping snaps of TempDB. Similarly, another one is replication. It's very common in VM settings for people to replicate storage from one place to another. This gets a little bit harder, but if I'm working with savvy SAN admins, they'll be able to not replicate the TempDB volume. Whereas if TempDB lives on the exact same storage as everybody else, you don't really have a choice. You're going to replicate, or I say the same storage, the same volume, the same drive letter, then it's going to get replicated along with all the user databases. And that's a real shame when you use features like RCSI that write like crazy to TempDB. I've seen scenarios where TempDB changed in completion, like it's 100 gig TempDB, changed multiple times per day, just your terabytes of writes that would be wasted moving across somewhere else. Another one is different paths to the storage. So when you start to work with high performance SQL servers, and I'm going to give an example of pure storage just because I've had a lot of clients who run into this. You want, if you have a high-end VM or high-end storage like Pure, you want 4 separate paths to the storage, 4 separate virtual SCSI adapters, and you want to route different volumes through different SCSI adapters, so that way you can get more throughput. Whereas if you route everything through just one volume on just one SCSI adapter, you end up competing with VMware's own internal limitations for throughput, which I had a client hit that recently. And then finally, the last one, I had to look down because I'd written down a couple of answers on here. Another one is different read and write cache setting optimizations. So in some SANs, some makes and models, you can specify different amounts of read or write cache on different volumes. So on some of them, I've seen for some vendors, they'll say, don't bother putting any read caching on TempDB, just cache writes, because we're usually worried about flowing over during a query's execution and we needing to be able to ingest a whole lot of data really quickly. But different SAN vendors will have different recommendations there. So there's that one. Next one, this one actually came from yesterday, but I loved it so much that I kept it around. Over on YouTube, Akshay asked, can we change from SQL Server to NoSQL? Can I change from my MySQL database over to MongoDB? For a while, like 10, 15, 20 years ago, there was a wave of people and application development tools that wanted to make it easy to write your application once and then change the back end. These days, nobody does that. It's a giant pain in the rear. Surly Dev likes the dark mode. I do too. I think it's kind of cool because of the I've got a really nice camera and lens, and I never thought about, oh, geez, I should just, take advantage of this. It works with hardly any light, like just the light on the monitor. And even that light changes when I switch over to SSMS because it throws out so much light. So it's kind of cool. It's like the adult rated version of Office Hours, Office After Hours. Kind of fun. So let's see here. Next up, over on Facebook, Zishan asked, how do I fix log file corruption issues? We rebuilt the log file, but after sometimes it gets corrupt again. What can be the issue and how to detect it? In those horror movies, the scary movies that you watch sometimes, it's like this when it's all dark. In those horror movies, every now and then they'll hear a scream coming from inside the house, and what do? They go investigate the house. And when that's happening, when people are walking into the haunted house, you sitting in the theater or at home, you're like, don't go in there. Why would you go in there? And it doesn't make any sense. That's what you're doing. You're in a haunted house. Your storage is corrupt. Maybe it's your storage subsystem. Maybe it's your Windows install. Maybe it's your hardware. Who knows what it is? But you're going in there going, I hear some screams in there. Let's go in and check it out. This house seems nice. I wonder why no one's in here. Get out. Get out of the house. Get out of the house. Until you can do root cause analysis, don't bother sticking around when corruption is happening. It just doesn't make sense. Open up a support call with Microsoft and your hardware vendor, but it's most likely going to be a hardware problem. Next up, says, my second cousin twice removed, I think he means, I like that, says, in a couple instances, he heard you say that one of the advantages of SQL Server over Postgres is parallelism. He asks, what's the difference in parallelism performance between Postgres and SQL Server? Take a data warehouse. So take my data warehouse, please. So take a data warehouse where you have to scan a 1 terabyte fact table. You got to scan a 1 terabyte fact table, and you've got to group sales together by product. Would you like 1 CPU core doing that work, or would you like 8 or 16 cores doing that work? Generally speaking, when you parallelize big data work like multi-terabyte queries, then they'll go linearly faster as you add additional cores. It's not directly linearly faster, but if you have an 8-core system, it'll generally go 4-6 times faster than a single core system. So that's how parallelism works. Next up, over on YouTube, Venkat says, good morning, good morning. As an admin, what are the key items to be focused on while migrating and changing compat level? The big one is don't change compat level unless there's not anywhere near the way that SQL Server does. So you'll want to read more about the differences between those two. Don't change the compat level just because you change SQL Server. If you go up to a newer version of SQL Server, leave the database on the older compat level for a while. Then, if you want to change to the newer compat level, do it in a dev environment first and start to see how your queries perform differently. But when you change compat levels, you really will get different queries that are suddenly slow. So make sure that you're walking into that for a good reason, as opposed to you wouldn't want to be the database administrator who in production says, I heard this is good, and then you change compat level and bam, next thing you know, your queries perform like stale bread. Over on YouTube, Majin Blaze says, my friend says not to use linked servers. When should exceptions be made? I'm one of those people who says the only time exceptions should be made is for utility purposes, like if I need to pull configuration data on a once a day basis from one SQL server to another, but I would never, ever, ever want to let user queries go run across linked servers. The easy way to explain that is, you remember how in middle school, if you really had a crush on somebody, you'd talk to their friend and you'd be like, hey, I really have a crush on so-and-so. Can you pass them this note? And you know how it didn't work really well? Like they never really took you up on that? That's kind of how linked servers work. You really don't want to be passing notes back and forth between people. You just want to go to the person that has the thing that you want. Also, you're attractive. You shouldn't be afraid of them. You should just go step up to them and just go start talking to them. You're nice. They'll like you. With a name like that, how could they not? Over on YouTube, Beth says, if I want to count the data that's updated quite frequently, is it possible to use column store index to achieve this? No, let's step back and say, why do you want a count of data? Like, what is it that you're trying to do? If you do like the count of data, I usually get nervous when people say just go count the number of rows in something. I'm like, why do we need that up to date? If you just need it, just put an index on it. It doesn't need to be column store, but any index will help you out there. Column store is has a kryptonite there. Column store doesn't work out very well in places where you do updates. So, and to learn more about that, you can see my Fundamentals of Column Store class. Next up, G-Surgeon from the Netherlands says, I noticed that in a 400 gig database, some of the biggest tables have a fill factor of 90. I want to change that. Any drawbacks of scheduling a job to execute a script? Or is it a potentially disruptive process? So the thing is, it's going to rebuild the entire table when you go to rebuild them. And if you have something that doesn't have a lot of log file space, something where the log file backups are slow, something where you're doing database mirroring or always on availability groups over to another location, it's real easy for people to churn through a huge index rebuild and then totally fill up their transaction logs and cause their availability groups or database mirrors to get way far behind. So what I would do is I would do it manual. First I'd list the objects that you want to change in order of size from the smallest objects to the biggest objects. And this is actually what I do with clients. From the smallest tables to the largest tables, so that way I'll give them the commands in that order. And I'm like, look, I want you to run these one at a time. And when you hit the point where your log file is growing or your availability group is becoming too large, stop and wait. Let it flush out and then go continue to run the next couple. If you know your environment really well and you know that it doesn't have those problems, then you can bypass that. But the rest of the time, start with the small tables first. Next up, Sujit says, we're planning on migrating to SQL Server 2019. Are there still any major bugs where we should look out for? Go to SQLServerUpdates.com. SQLServerUpdates.com is a site where I list the cumulative updates for SQL Server, what's come out, and what bugs are present in each cumulative update. Unfortunately, Microsoft doesn't publish a list of known bugs that are outstanding. When you hit a bug, you have to go call Microsoft, pay $500, and open a support case. That's a little disappointing. I wish that they had a centralized repository like most open source projects do, where you go to the issues list and you can go sort by like which ones are most commented or most frequently updated, and you can see what's broken. But unfortunately with SQL Server, there isn't a way to see what's still broken. I wish there was. Next up, DB Best says DB says best tool to visualize performance measurements. No, it's not open source, no. But it doesn't mean you can't use GitHub for like issue tracking. Best tool to visualize performance management. I am okay with, I'm less about, picking the ultimate specific tool, and I'm more about which tool is the one that you find easiest to use. So all the performance monitoring tools that are out there, Quest Spotlight, Idera SQL DM, SentryOne SQL Sentry, Redgate SQL Monitor, like all the tools that are out there have free 14-day evaluations. Go install them and then go see which one that you like the best. I really don't have any preference because they all, for me, kind of get the job done. I'm okay with any of them at this point, but I'd start there. Next up, DB says, how to buy courses when living in the EU. Why don't you make a deal with a company in the EU so you can buy from them? The problem that we've hit for years and years is that the only way I sell my courses is via streaming. I don't want to give you the downloads because I know how you people are with downloads. You put them up on the Napsters and you share them. You pass them around. I know because I've seen lots of people doing that kind of thing with like training class recordings. One of my favorite instances ever was I was presenting at an in-person user group. And before I present, the local user group leader always gets in front of the class and says, okay, here are the announcements. And this in-person user group leader says, hey, everyone, also, I just attended a class by so-and-so, and I recorded the whole class. I recorded the audio of the class. So if anyone needs that, come get the USB drive from me and you can copy it. And I was like, you utter moron. I am in the room and I know those instructors. Why would you ever want to do that? So because of that, I'm really hesitant to give my recordings to someone else because it's literally how I pay my rent. Like if I lose that, I am not able to pay for the roof over my head. So there will come a point where we start selling to the EU. It just isn't anytime soon right now, unfortunately. Why don't you try and work with your lawmakers so they don't pass such crappy laws? And California's is a great example. So California has an exemption for smaller companies, so that if you have if you handle less than a certain amount of private data and all that, then you're exempt from those laws, which is absolutely fantastic. Rumi says, how do I improve performance on a select query on a big table that our app truncates and inserts rows every few hours a day? So I would say go to a query tuning class. So like my fundamentals of query tuning or mastering query tuning, which happened to be on sale this week. This week, we've got the Black Friday sales happening at Brent Ozara Unlimited. And over there, you can watch my fundamentals of index tuning, fundamentals of query tuning, mastering index tuning, mastering queries tuning, all kinds of stuff like that. Like Column Store, I have a whole fundamentals of Column Store class that's a day long. All those are on sale right now this week. You can go get those over at brentozar.com/Black Friday. So. Next up, Contact Administrator, good to see you again, says, we're starting a backup tool that is using VSS SQL Server writers, and it freezes the OS for moments. What can go wrong? Oh, that's such a good question. If you search on my site for VSS backups, I've actually got a post on that, or several posts on that exact thing. The classic problem, Simon, are you saying I'm not that bright? Is that what you're saying? So the classic problem that we run into with these is that the VSS backup program takes the snap and holds it for too long, and then database mirrors fail over, always-on availability groups fail over, Windows clusters fail over, all of that stuff. So that's the classic symptom that we run into all the time. Next up, Havidigalur from Iceland, and I'm probably mispronouncing the bejesus out of that. Says it's a purely theoretical or purely hypothetical situation. We'll be upgrading from SQL Server Express 2008 R2 to 2014. How will that affect performance? It's funny, I have never played around with Express Edition in the sense of performance tuning. Because for me, just as a consultant perspective, I'm like, the performance on that is so crappy. You know, it's just like a laptop or a iPad grade performance. It just doesn't make sense to invest in performance tuning in it for me. Like the smallest server I would ever get involved with would be Standard Edition. So could you expect a performance drop? The thing that I would be more aware of is the size of CPUs, like and how fast the CPUs are and how fast the storage is. That the faster the storage and CPUs are, that's probably going to have a bigger impact anyway, since Express Edition is still single-threaded. Next up, over on YouTube, Binu asks, I'm getting page IO latch waits and page latch waits. Leads to max worker threads, and we had to fail over the AG and reboot the secondary to sync up. Yep, you're correct. This place is for questions, too. If you have a question, you can ask a question. Next up, Ruben says, I just restarted my computer, started hearing Brent. It's like you're in my room. Oh, you're welcome. Being called for Sunday lunch. Oh, that sounds lovely. I think lunch in the UK is always so cool. Next up, let's see. Gaunt Reality says, what is batch execution mode and what is it for? Batch execution mode originally came out for column store indexes because it would basically pass data around from one operator to another operator differently. The way that column store works is it's really kind of like an index on every column, but there's no clustered index in the way that you're used to it, like 8K pages that hold the entire contents of the row. So the batch mode, it started to make sense. Well, why would we rebuild the row from scratch and then pass rows around? Could there be other ways that we could move data from operator to operator? So it started for column store indexes, and then over time, as Microsoft got into, say, SQL Server 2019, they started to realize that it's good for reports, too. If you have plain old report queries on row store indexes, it works well there as well. So it's really good for report queries. Let's see here. Next up, Manish says, I read that Postgres launched parallelism from version 9.6 for very specific small parts of small operations, yes, and they've been gradually adding it over the years, but it's still nowhere near as pervasive through the engine that SQL Server is. SQL Server will almost do everything inside the engine parallel, with a few rare exceptions. Eriker from Iceland over on YouTube says, I'm designing a new SaaS environment to be hosted on the cloud platform of the client's choice. I'm thinking of keeping each client on a separate SQL Server instance. A managed DB might work. I have a blog post about this, and I'll show it to you. So let's see how the dash. Oh, it worked. Oh, I was worried because I didn't have a whole lot of light in here that gray screen wouldn't work as well. Let's get the blog post on that. Let's say it is MultiClient SaaS site, brenozar.com. There we go. How to design multi-client databases. If you search for how to design multi-client databases, I have a blog post on that, and I put a lot of work into that because I have a lot of SaaS clients that have to face this kind of thing, and I lay out the pros and cons of the different ways to do it inside there. All right, let's see. Next up, we have let's throw that one in. Let's see here. Ashish says, we have 200 databases on one SQL Server instance with standard. Will dividing those databases across multiple instances be feasible as we have 256 gigs of RAM? The question I'd say is, what's the problem you're trying to solve? If the problem you're trying to solve is, we want to use that extra RAM, the first question I'd ask is, do you need it? because I would sure hate to have you do a whole lot of work, because it's going to be a project to add another instance, to move over a whole bunch of databases, to disrupt the users and make them change application connections. I would want to make sure that you actually need additional RAM before you go through that whole entire exercise. Standard Edition actually uses above and beyond 128 gigs of RAM. So you'll even see as you go through and measure your SQL Server and the amount of memory that it's using, that it's going over 128, which is kind of awesome. So I wouldn't go there just out of, hey, we want to do it. Make sure to measure that you have a memory problem first. Next up, Victor says, what's the recommended version to migrate a 2008 R2 instance to? I think Microsoft would suggest the newest possible. They would. And one person, supposedly an MVP, told me that Microsoft suggested going version by version. What the Sam hell? Why would you do that? Yeah, so what you have to do is you got to jump to the newest version that supports restoring from 2008 R2. I'm pretty sure that 2019 still does. I'm not 100% positive, but go download SQL Server 2019 Developer Edition, take one of your backups and go restore into it. And I'm pretty sure that you can restore straight from 2008 R2 to 2019. Assuming that you wanted to go to 2019. And I say that because I distribute the Stack Overflow databases in 2008 format, and I'm pretty sure people can still just restore them straight on 2019. So good question, though. The thing with the person is supposedly an MVP, we have the same problem pops up when people say someone from Microsoft told me. Everybody, whether they're an MVP, a community member, or Microsoft, don't ever confuse like what status they have with the truth. Because there are people from Microsoft who don't specialize in the thing you're asking about. There are people who are MVPs who don't specialize in the thing that you're asking about. Also, people often mishear stuff. So, like any time that you hear someone say something, just ask, hey, can I get a follow-up on that in writing? This is important to me, etc. Eric from Iceland asks, question number 2. You get unlimited questions. You're okay. I like you. Most of you are actually, that's all of you maybe? I mean, I guess all of you so far. Well, I don't think we've had any buttholes in chat today, which is kind of nice and refreshing, isn't it? Eric says, maybe it's the dark mode. Maybe dark mode helped. Maybe it's like more intimate and it feels like you can be more respectful or something. Maybe you don't want to get angry when it's all light. No, I don't want to turn the lights on. Which of the best known cloud platforms have the best SQL Server bang for the buck? So for me, I never get to choose the cloud platform based on what I want in SQL Server. The cloud platform is usually something that's chosen by a bunch of executives who have all kinds of other goals they're trying to meet. Like maybe a company needs to use Azure because they get a bunch of free licensing bucks in Azure. Maybe a company needs to use AWS because there's one particular service they want to use in AWS. So for me, I don't really get to choose the platform. I will tell you that in terms of VM performance, I consistently have much better results with AWS than I do with Azure. AWS has more instance types, more flexibility, more places where you can get more instance types. So for me, I've just stuck with Amazon for so long. I don't hear crappy stuff about Azure other than the storage performance is pretty atrocious. But as long as you learn how to work around the storage performance, it's not so bad. The view through my window is downtown San Diego, California. I think if I step across, it might autofocus for you. Yeah, there you go. That is the San Diego Public Library right there. The Central Library is the one with the little dome window on there. Surly says wrong window. Next up, Teja says over on YouTube, do you have any opinions on Azure Synapse? And are any SQL Constant Care users that use it? It's a totally different product. It has totally different ways of managing and monitoring, so we don't support it with SQL Constant Care. My opinions on the technology are that it's brilliant. Like, I love the way it's designed under the hood. I think it was visionary. When they first bought it from a company called Datalegro, the original version of it, I was like, everything I see with this thing, I just utterly love. It's genius. Now, granted, everything's got bugs and everything's got ways that it doesn't work well, but I think it looks really neat. I don't have any customers using it, but it's because I tend to specialize in emergency performance tuning. I have friends who work on it, and I have friends whose companies have adopted it. It sucked when it was on premises because it was really expensive. It didn't suck, but the pricing sucked. And I think now it's a better, more doable option just because it's up in the cloud and you can be more flexible there in terms of pricing. Next up, over on YouTube, David DePreto says, I have an app doing only reads to reduce downtime. What about wrapping the ETL inside a serializable? No. 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 If you're trying to reduce downtime, that wouldn't be the approach that I would use. Doing specific design on that is kind of beyond the scope of what I can do quickly during the webcast, but the answer there is no, don't do that. If you want to learn more about that tuning for that kind of thing, on Twitch, follow Andy Leonard. Andy Leonard on Twitch does a whole lot of data warehousing style work, and you can ask him that question. He may have the time to go into it in much more detail, but no, don't do that. I can see why you would want to, but no, there be dragons. Next up, Vimal says, hello, Ozzy. Do I look like Ozzy? I guess I'm old now. Is it necessary to apply every patch when SQL Server releases SQL Server? Sometimes patches break the database. Necessary is a tricky word. The way that I would tell people to approach patching is whenever a cumulative update comes in, what I would do is read the list of things that are fixed inside of it and ask yourself if you're having any of those problems. Because when a cumulative update comes out that fixes incorrect query results, like you may look at that and go, I don't think my users are having this, oh my God, queries are returning incorrect results, then your users may actually be facing that. So what I would do is I would probably stay like maybe 2 to 4 weeks behind, but 2 to 4 weeks after a cumulative update comes out, put it in your dev environments, then QA, then DR, then out in production. But I'm a fan of putting in the patches in place because they fix so many bugs. The list of bugs fixed in each one is just absolutely atrocious. Bandar says, how do you punch IT distribution lists and project managers in the face and not get fired? I love The Art of War. Go pick up the book Art of War by Sun Tzu. And there are modern interpretations of it, especially business books, that will lay out, here's what Sun Tzu was talking about for battle, here's what that means in modern business. And it really teaches you how to go to war and win and how to not go to war. Because really, your end goal is not going to war. But if you go to war, you absolutely have to win with overwhelming force. And there's so much good stuff in there. I have literally sat in a client meeting. I've literally sat in a client meeting and gone to war with someone sitting across the table from me. And when I say go to war, here's what I said. This person kept pointing their finger at me and saying that I was doing something. And I wasn't even working for the company that was doing it, but he kept pointing his finger across me. And I said several times calmly, so, sir, I need you to stop pointing your finger at me and saying you. I didn't do that. You know, the person who's doing that is sitting right here in the room. Kept doing it. And eventually I said, he leaned across and he said, you. And I said, if you point your finger at me and you say you one more time, I'm going to take this soda can, I'm going to climb across the table, and I'm going to shove it down your throat. And immediately everybody in the room just kind of sits back and goes, wait, what? And I said, it's up to you to figure out whether or not I'm joking. And I set the can back down. I went to war. And then when that guy, the next time, because it was a long meeting, the next time he turns to me and he goes, And then he turned to the software vendor and goes, you, and I was like, I win. That's it, done. And everybody just died laughing. That was the end of it. And I did not get called back into that client. I didn't want to get called back into that client, but I wanted to set the statement of, if you're gonna bring me in here and you're gonna have somebody point their finger at me and kick my ass all day long, we're not gonna have that for very long. Kirubel says, do you know a good DBA interview questions list, a free one? So the problem with free interview questions is that anybody can Google those and anybody can read them. So everybody kind of knows that you're faking. I've even Googled DBA interview questions. I've found answers that are incorrect, and I've used those as interviews with folks because that I know if they give me the interview fake answer, they don't really actually have any experience. So be careful doing that. It can backfire pretty badly. Thesagian says, love the stream. Glad, thank you. Are column store good index is a good idea on a transactional table. I have a course for that actually, and it's on sale this week. So if you go to my Fundamentals of Column Store classes, I spend a whole day showing you the internals of how column store indexes work. And I give you all kinds of examples of what will cause your queries to go slower and what will cause your queries to go faster. I have you prove whether a table is going to be quicker or slower with column store indexes on it. And I show you how to identify if your tables are a good fit for column store indexes. So you can go to get that over at brentozar.com/Black Friday, where through the end of this week, all my courses are on sale from between 50% to like 86% off. So that one's my Fundamentals of Column Store class. Enjoy. I love that one. I had so much fun. Yusef says, my SQL Server took all my disk space. How can I reduce? I always like to keep things in perspective, and so I actually keep a flash drive here on my desk. This is a 128 gig USB 3 thumb drive, and it's so small I can't even get the camera to focus on it. That's how small it is. Keep focus that don't try to shrink your database files. If it's something that you could go get a $40 thumb drive from Amazon or from CVS or your local, Kinko's, to just do easy with that. If we're talking about multiple terabytes, then it makes sense. But otherwise, just go get a bigger disk drive. They're just not that expensive compared to SQL Server licensing. Remember, SQL Server licensing is $2,000 US per core for standard edition, $7,000 US per core for enterprise edition. Next up, Erica from Iceland, question number 3. I'm working on a series of articles on T-SQL code performance testing. What's your favorite method for such testing? Oh, okay. So I'm going to write this out. I'm going to switch to another window and I'm going to write it out because there are several attributes that I use. So when I am testing performance on a query, the things that I'm comparing, when I'm comparing two queries to each other, I usually want to test by logical reads, CPU milliseconds, query duration in milliseconds, seconds, memory grant, parallelism, or single-threaded. And then I should say memory grant given, memory grant used, including spills. So these are the ways that I think about measuring SQL Server queries when I'm measuring between one to the other to see which one was faster or slower. Now, of course, the more that you want to gather, the more of a pain in the rear it is. So it takes you more time and collecting more data. So what I'll usually do when I'm running and gunning, like very quick performance tuning something, I'll pick just the one that the server's bottlenecked on. For example, if I'm facing page IO latch waits, I'll measure by logical reads. If I'm on SOS scheduler yield is my biggest wait time, then when I'm tuning queries, I'll compare their CPU milliseconds. If I'm dealing with resource semaphore waits, then I'll focus first on the memory grant size and so forth. Then when I get really close to picking which of a couple of last final qualification versions of a query or indexes make the most sense, then I measure by the whole shebang and compare those two. But just when I first get started, I just pick one of those and roll. Hopefully that helps. Next up, let's see here. Richie says the theme has turned to light. That's true, and now I should actually turn the lights on. Let's see how that works. Let's see here. We'll kick this guy on, and then we'll kick the other one on. Oh, that's probably a pretty good starting point. Let me go switch the camera around a little bit here. And one back down to you, and then I'll turn this other light on over here if I can remember where that is. There that goes. Perfect. Code says, any advice on how and what to learn first? I'd like to cross over the tech field by becoming a SQL developer. I'm from a non-tech background. So was I. I did the same kind of transition. The thing that I would do is I would seek out the person in your company who has the most control over your pay. Like the most control over your raise, how much you work, what your job duties are. Go sit from them and go, okay, what's the technical problem that you need solved that you can't get solved today? Like, what is it that would help this company make more money or help you get a promotion? What could I do with technology to solve that pain? So for example, when I was back in the hotel business, I did that with my boss and I said, okay, what's the technical problem that you can't solve right now? And he was like, oh my God, my budget spreadsheets are a giant pain in the rear. I have all these spreadsheets I have to manage. And so I was like, okay, let me figure out how to work spreadsheets. And eventually I figured out how to work that stuff into a database to make that manager's job easier. And the more that I could make their job easier, the more they would make sure that I was taken care of from a payroll perspective, and make sure that I got enough training resources to continue to amp up their career. So basically one manager just took me around all over the place. Zahid Butt, welcome to the stream, Zahid Butt. Maybe it's Zahid's butt, who knows. On a related note, Falmy says, I need to learn SQL Hotel, Motel, Holiday Inn. Falmy says, I need to learn SQL from scratch. Where do I start? Pick up a book. Because the SQL's been around for so long that it's really easy to find a book about SQL Server, MySQL, Oracle, whatever your favorite flavor is. And they're so cheap. You know, you can get them on Kindle for like $5-10. I would start there just because it's a good way to understand how the language works. If you prefer learning via video, then check YouTube for tutorials, but there are tons. Definitely start with something off free or as cheaply as you can. Next up, Teja says, have you seen anyone using column store indexes on Express? Column store tends to focus on big data, like the problems that it solves are really best approached with, think at least 10, 50, 100 gig tables. Tables, not databases, but just individual tables, which of course is beyond the scope of Express, so it doesn't really make sense. Next up, Francis on YouTube says, when you do performance tuning, how much do you use traces? Never. Not at all. Not. Remember, folks, just only ask questions once. Please don't ask them more than once. If you ask them more than once, we're going to just eject you from the channel. So how much do I use traces? I don't use them at all. This is the year 2020, and profiler traces haven't made much sense for about the last decade. If you find yourself in a spot where you want to use traces, instead, check out the plan cache. So start with the plan cache, and then after that, use extended events. Next up, Bartek says, why do Microsoft SQL Server and Oracle have different index organizations? Oh, that's an interesting question. So really what they're each trying to do is get better performance than the other. They're each trying to get more bang for the buck. So they're each just sitting around with, a bunch of developers going, all right, how can we tackle this problem and make it as fast as possible? And they're both in a race, so they're going to come up with different designs. Even open source is the same thing. You'll see open source products, like think of all the NoSQL platforms there are out there. They're all solving the same problem in wildly different ways, which I kind of think of as cool. I think it's really neat. Next up, my friend asks over on YouTube, DB says, can I use one of the SP Blitz procs to see which database uses the most resources, not only as a snapshot, but in a 24-hour period? Absolutely you can. And to do it, I have a course this week on this, I believe Wednesday. I teach you how to use the first responder kit. In my class, how I use the first responder kit, I teach you how to do that plus much more. If you go to brentozar.com/Black Friday, you can go for just that one class if you want. How I use the first responder kit is, if I remember right, around $50, ballpark. So you can attend that class and I'll teach you that answer inside there. It's a little beyond what I could go into quickly inside of a demo, but absolutely, I do that in that very class. So enjoy. Next up, Addie from YouTube says, what strategy do you recommend for for a Medition upgrade? Oh, it's really easy. You do have to take downtime to do it, but all you have to do is go run through the setup again, go download the setup and go run it. And there is a SKU upgrade installer, so you can just run it again and you can change your SKU, put in a different key number, stuff like that. So it totally works. Lego Logic says, thoughts on NoSQL? I really love NoSQL because there are a lot of things that people put into databases that never really made sense to put into a relational database. Great example, we have a product called Paste the Plan, where you can go to our website, paste an execution plan, and share it with somebody else. We don't need a relational database. We don't need any kind of joins between columns. We just need to save an XML and then be able to retrieve that XML, or save the file location of an XML even. So I love it. I think I'm a huge fan, absolute huge fan. I always think of myself as like a carpenter. I have a whole bunch of tools laid out on my desk. It's all about picking the right tool for the problem that you're facing. So here inside our own company, in the development that Richie does for the company, we actually don't use SQL Server at all. We use Amazon DynamoDB. I think we still use Elastic Cache and AWS Aurora Postgres. So just finding the right tool for the job. Welcome to the club, Lex Optimix. Nice name. I started choking there. I should have a sip of my tasty beverage. Delicious. Oh, wow, Coyote. Coyote, we haven't seen you in a while. Well, or you haven't asked a question in a while. Good to see you again. What do you do to improve and refresh your own skill set? That's such a great question. I tend to, when I have a running list of problems that clients face, that they go, we need to move to the new version of SQL Server when it can do blank. And so when a new version of SQL Server comes out, new build, Microsoft touts a new feature or whatever, I will go actively use that in my lab using the Stack Overflow database, trying to solve the problem that the client is having. The other thing that I'll do when Microsoft brings out a feature that I don't have clients who are interested in using, but I just want to learn it just for fun, I'll go like, okay, what would be the business problem that would drive me to use this? And then how could I put in a proof of concept? Now, this takes work. This takes a ton of work. So to give you perspective on behind the scenes as a consultant and trainer, for years, for 5-10 years, I tried to schedule my calendar so that I could do 2 days a week of R&D and 3 days a week of paid work. So during the 2 days a week of R&D, that was writing presentations, writing blog posts, whatever. Those numbers change through the years. There are times when I need to work more. There are times when I choose to work less. But it's all about doing those kinds of experiments. And hands-on. For me, it's all hands-on. Because plus, the kinds of stuff that I want to learn, there's usually no material about yet. It's not like I can read a book about it because it's usually brand new coming in from Microsoft. Next up, Tage says, have you found any issues in SQL Server 2019 when you got an unintended batch mode? So you don't really intend to get batch mode. It's not like you go, I want batch mode for this query before you execute it. SQL Server picks and chooses where it wants to put batch mode in. It's kind of like the way that I feel about an index seek versus a scan. I don't write a query intending I want to seek here and I want to scan here. It's just that sometimes you get them and sometimes you don't. Another way that I would ask that question, though, is I would say, have you ever got batch mode and it backfired, like it made things worse instead of better? In 2016 and 17, yes. In 2019, no. I have been really lucky with 2019's batch mode that it's just been fantastic. Yeah, Orange Peel, absolutely. All the ones that you're seeing over here on the side. Go over to brentozar.com/training, and I have tons of them. Or just go to brentozar.com and click training up at the top. Erica is going for the question number 476. On NoSQL formats, any thoughts on the difference between XML and JSON? And I'm trying to train myself to say JSON instead of JSON. I've like always. I don't even know what you could rewrite that question. I'm not even sure what you're asking. Any thoughts of the differences? As the database admin, I don't usually get to make the choice of what format the data comes in on. So I don't actually have any opinions on those two, back and forward. The thing that I would say is Microsoft has more indexing capabilities, or SQL Server has more indexing capabilities for XML than they do for JSON. For JSON, see, I did it again. For JSON, it feels like they were just kind of checking a box and go, yep, you can put JSON in here, ship it, and then they didn't ever improve it at all. So I think it feels like they were just checking a box, whereas XML, they checked the box, but they checked it a little harder, so that you could actually add indexes inside there. Next up, Scott asks, are there any worthwhile commercial backup products that run faster? Holy smokes, my air filter just kicked on big time. Somebody fart in here? What's going on with that? Commercial backup products that run faster, compress better than the native SQL backup? Yeah, like all of them. Quest Lightspeed, Idera SQL Safe, Redgate SQL Backup, like all of them run faster, compress better, have better encryption options, you name it. It comes down to whether you want that capability bad enough to pay for it, and if you want all the other cool tools that they have. They have a lot of tools like reading a transaction log, pulling single tables out, or pulling a single stored procedure out. They have all kinds of cool capabilities. Next up, Bay says, if I want to get the count of a current data row for reporting purposes as soon as before it's being refreshed due to ever-changing. I'm still not sure that I understand what your question is, so this probably isn't going to work in this webcast. What you might want to do is ask that over at dba.stackexchange.com, but include an example, like include the example of the problem that you're trying to solve and why it's going slowly, and that may help. Because I can't understand exactly what you're going for there. Binu asks over on YouTube, what's the difference between logical disk and physical disk counters in Perfmon? Logical disk counters are about volumes, and you can have a single physical disk that's broken up into multiple volumes. These days, for me, both of those are kind of garbage. They're not very accurate in terms of, there's a lot of abstraction layers in between your SQL Server and Windows and the storage. So I don't use those at all for planning migration. Because plus two, remember, this is only, AV says, I have a feeling it was a pre-recorded video. I have a feeling that you're a robot. Hopefully we're both wrong. So I don't use those counters at all. I understand where you're coming from, but the thing that I would start is just synthetic disk tests. Go run a synthetic disk test, something like Crystal Disk Mark. And I know, heaven forbid, if Argenis Fernandez is listening in on that, it's not that I recommend using Crystal Disk Mark as like an absolute Bible to measure storage. It's just that it'll give me a real fast idea of whether the current storage is hot or not, and then try the same thing on your new storage. And on your laptop, because very often I find that people's laptops are faster than their production SQL servers. Next up, Simon says, regarding parameter sniffing, have you seen many shops that use template plan guides to do force print? No, I have not. And the tone of my voice when I said no made it sound like I wanted to poop on plan guides. Plan guides are fine, nothing wrong with them, totally okay. I just don't see a lot of people who use them, because the problem is that the instant anything changes about the query, the template can break. Like somebody will change a stored procedure or change the query in the application, and then the template won't match. So I haven't seen anybody doing that. I also don't have any negative feelings towards it whatsoever. Next up, Vinit says, hi, I built a multi-tenant system with Postgres multi-schema. It worked well. Will SQL Server help in this case, and how is multiple schema performance? So in SQL Server, it makes no difference how many schemas you have inside a database in terms of backup and recovery. Doesn't matter whether you have 1,000 schemas or just a single schema. When SQL Server does backups, everything in SQL Server, most things in SQL Server are stored in 8K pages, which you can kind of think of them as pieces of paper. When SQL Server does backups, it's just throwing the 8K pages out to a backup file as quickly as possible, and it doesn't care what the contents are. It has nothing to do with the contents at all. So let's see here. Next up, Harshad says, I have a SQL Server backup from 2017. Can I restore on an earlier version? No. Unfortunately, no. Next up, Contact Administrator says, when purging databases becomes the only solution when server has started to respond slow and tuning isn't helping. You don't know what you're doing. That's when it's time to ask for help. I do consulting. Also, I can teach you so that your skills don't suck. I promise the real sessions are a lot louder than this. I just didn't want your boss to hear that your skills sucked and you haven't been to class. That's why I run training classes. I would tell you about them again, but I've already said it a few times in this video. So go attend a class. Next up, ZPM Fred says, hello from France. I was profiling SQL Server 300 statements, dedicated rate, NBI, my time. Any idea what this time is spent on? So if I don't use Profiler for that. Profiler is not a great tool for performance tuning. I understand that it was great 20 years ago when my hair was black instead of gray. It totally made sense. It's like haircut 30, which is why I'm back to hats this week. That is true. That is, I am much more friendly during my training classes. But it's time to up your skills. Don't use Profiler anymore. Start using things like the plan cache and extended events, which can tell you things like what SQL Server was waiting on during that time. Do you have a CPU problem, a blocking problem, a memory problem? There's all kinds of problems that you can have that you can learn about via the execution plans and the plan cache that you won't won't learn from your grandpa's Profiler. Is my credit card going to be charged? Insert your Bitcoins now. Don't insert your Bitcoins there. The other hole. Next up, Sulfur asks a question that comes up very often. Shit, I haven't looked at the clips in a while. I totally need to pull clips again. I need to do a blog post with a bunch of the clips early up. Sulfur says, is it useful to get Microsoft certificates since I see a lot of these will be removed and retire? This is such an interesting question. So let's say that you're trying to get a job and your resume is in a huge stack of resumes with strangers. Where certifications help is that when the hiring administrator has a big, huge stack of resumes, sometimes the way that they'll rip a lot of people out quickly is they'll look for something that differentiates people, and they'll say, well, people who haven't even bothered to get a cert, we're going to pull them out of the pile. So it's true in the sense that if you have a cert that happens to match the checkbox that they're looking for, that'll get you there. But if you are going for a job and you're the only resume, you're in a resume that's in a stack of other resumes, you are already screwed. Take the time that you would spend researching on a cert and go start writing blog posts instead. Because as you start to write blog posts, do YouTube streams, Twitch, whatever, then people will start to reach out to you and ask for you, and you won't be in a stack of resumes. As the more that you do this, they won't even ask for your resume. Now, that's the really long-term stretch, but I want you to be able to have a career where you're not in this sea of resumes, where there's less competition for the job that you want. Next, interesting. Digikin says, I know this isn't about SQL, but what is Citus? I want to say it's Citus is how they pronounce it. DB, and why is it becoming popular? The only reason I know the answer to this question is because we do Postgres work, not for consulting, but Richie and I use Postgres. Richie uses Postgres. I just kind of fumble around in the dark like a teenager in the backseat. Not with Richie. Richie and I are not in the same car. Sometimes we are in the same car, but we're always in the front seats, and there's no fumbling around. What is size DB? It's like a juiced up version of Postgres. And if I remember right, it has better clustering and replication. I can't remember offhand like what's better about it, but it's a for-pay version of Postgres that has more cool capabilities. So. Next, W. Rabirson says, in your experience, does entity attribute value schemas data models worth the effort? It's not that they're extra effort, they're less effort. They're easier to build when you first get started, but then they're hell to performance tune. I do love you, but we don't fumble around in the car. We go into the house. They're easier for the application, but they suck to performance tune long term. Indexing is very bad. Joins are very bad. So that's where the stuff starts to backfire. What I would say is, if you want to use entity attribute value, don't use SQL Server. Go use like a key value store. Go use any kind of NoSQL database and just store stuff as XML or JSON inside there. Don't bother with a relational database if you're not relating your data. Point of a relational database, all the performance optimizations are around when there are relations. But with the EAB, there are no relations. Next up, Naveen says, what is the difference between a view and a materialized view? A view is syntax that just makes your life easier for querying, but it doesn't make your query go faster. It's just kind of like a map in between tables. So if you say, I want to get to Iceland very quickly, you open up the map and the view will show you how to get there. A materialized view actually writes the whole thing down to disk, actually makes copies of the data just as if they were tables. So it's way faster to query because it's effectively like saying, I want to go to Iceland, and suddenly you're in Iceland. But of course, building all of that out sucks. Every time you insert, update, or delete a row, you're also inserting, updating, and deleting it in the materialized view as well. That's not true, Adam. There are a lot of gotchas inside materialized views, but be really careful when you say stuff like that, because plus two, some people are on different database platforms too as well. And that's not true. There are other kinds of stuff that you can do there. Next up, Lorad says, I have a proc which is taking nearly a minute to insert for a single row. SP who is active is showing IO completion. Execution plan shows a primary key on a schema-bound view. Oh, funny. That's funny how that works in. Using the target table. Is it possible to get past this issue without dropping the PK? This one's tough to explain without seeing the actual execution plan. So what I would do is paste the actual execution plan over at pastetheplan.com and then go ask a question on dba.stackexchange.com, and people can help you get into that. But it is kind of far beyond like what I could do just over verbally. It's a great question though, and you will get a good answer on it at dba.stackexchange.com. Victor says, is that a mechanical keyboard you have there? Indeed it is. It is a Keychron K8. I think it's a K8. Yeah, K8. Love it. Keychron's pretty cool. It's kind of thick. It's kind of, Richie turned me on to these. Turned me on. It's time for our ASMR podcast again. It's a Bluetooth or USB-C. It has, mine has white lighting, but hot swappable key switches. I like it quite a bit. I wish it was thinner, but I can live with that. That's not so bad. Next up, Binu says, how to fix the max thread issue due to page latch waits. After AG failovers, we're not seeing the issues again for some time. When it hits, we have to go through and do reboots. Well, I have a class on that. If you attend my Mastering Server Tuning class, we have a whole module just on thread pool. So I want to say like 60, 70 minutes long, where I explain all the different choices that you get in order to tune for max worker threads, the number of, the way the parallelism is set up, how the indexes work on the query, all kinds of stuff. So that's over in my Mastering Server Tuning class. Look out for the thread pool module there. You can attend all of my mastering classes for an entire year for $9.95. That's a huge drop from usually it's like $3,000 a year. And there's even a 2-year package this year. So you can attend all of my online classes for 2 years straight. Just go to your boss once, get the money once, and then you can keep learning. And even if you switch your jobs, just change the email address address on the account so that you can take the training with you, because they'll probably forget that they bought it for you, because your boss isn't all that sharp. Next up, Erica from Iceland, question number 687. Have you researched what of your favorite food is not available in Iceland? So this is interesting. I am one of those people who I can be happy pretty much anywhere, and wherever I go, I want to embrace whatever is local. So like I'm looking forward to more fish like cod, lamb, which are just, it's different here. It's not, I don't think it's as tasty here as it is over in Iceland. So I'm totally okay with what food isn't available there. I know there are things like certain kinds of spicy peanuts, that we like, certain flavors of Doritos or whatever. But we're really excited about getting over there and having different kinds of food. The thing that's going to suck is fresh fruit and vegetables, because we're going to be out in the countryside. We're going to be up in the north half of Iceland, and it's not very populous, and there aren't great grocery stores and all that. So time to wash my hands. What else am I missing out of there? The things that I'm worried about are TV networks. There are certain TV shows that we watch, Survivor, Big Brother, and we're worried that we're going to have a hard time getting those. I have a VPN that I've used in the past with hit or miss success, but it seems like the networks are always trying to break that down, so I may have to resort to like torrenting and stuff. Let's see here. Next up, Carl says, snapshots or DR? Would it be better to rely on DR? So DR is a task. It's not a technology. So you do disaster recovery with snapshots that are replicated to another SAN, log shipping, always on availability groups. There's a huge list of things that you can do DR with. But what you're asking is kind of like saying spoon or napkin. Like with it, those aren't the same thing. That's not really a question. Next up, Control K, Control C says, a friend of mine asked if she can buy your courses from Iran. I have no idea. Let our accounting firm manage that stuff, so you can go check and just go see. I admire your persistence in waiting until I have a live webcast and then typing a question in a queue in order to find out an answer that you could get in 30 seconds if you actually did it. So the friend of your girlfriend is quite frankly an idiot. So thankfully it's not you. You were smart enough to say that, but it just goes without saying, yes. Next up, Caesar says over on YouTube, a client can't or doesn't want to add memory to the server. The server has 8 cores and 8 gigs of RAM. SQL Server is $2,000 per core. 8 cores is $16,000. And they have less memory than your laptop. That doesn't make sense. Now, it says, after a few days, RAM is pinned to 90 to 95%. That's normal. SQL Server always uses all of the memory it can. It never backs down automatically just to like free up for no reason. You want SQL Server using all of your memory. Can limiting the use of the RAM mitigate the problem further? Sure. If you would like to simulate running your SQL Server on a phone, you could try to limit memory usage even lower. I don't think that's really going to make people happy, though. I think the real answer might not be to run SQL Server on an Etch-a-Sketch. That would probably be the first thing. That's true. Gee, Surgeon, you're absolutely right. Oh, Zane says, what language should I learn for the first time in my life? I'm going to actually put that to the audience. Let's see what y'all have for an answer there. So if you are going to learn a language for the first time, let's see what the audience picks. I'm going to give you 30 seconds to type in your answer so that he can get a feel for it over there in Slack or in chat. I think that's a pretty good PHP. There have been multiple votes for Klingon now. Mandarin. Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, that works. Yep, a lot of answers for Python. A lot of answers for Python and some for Go too as well. And I think that what the answers that you see here are probably a pretty good cross-section, DOS, emoji code, are a pretty good cross-section of what's out there. I think I would have gone for Python too myself, just because I think it presents the most possibility for your future. Next up, Anthony says, Brent, I hope maybe you can do a mock interview just to know if you can pass to standards. If you search my YouTube channel, which you're on actually, search for interview on there, and there are actually past interview or past things of me doing just that, like me doing interview courses. And then also, if you go to my site and go to training, I have a DBA job interview class where I do that. What I do is I ask you the question and I wait, and you like pause the video, say whatever your answer would have been, unpause, and then when you come back to me, I actually tell you what I was looking for in the answer. So that's and that one's just $29 is my DBA interview course. Next up, TagerReb says, I'm a Microsoft BI guy. I've done some performance tuning. Can I bring this up in an interview subtly, like without giving an idea that makes it look more than what I actually do? So the problem you're facing there is called imposter syndrome, because you believe that everybody else knows more and that you're the only one Googling for answers. I have wonderful news. All these people typing stuff inside the chat and comments, they have no idea what in the hell they are doing. They are all amateurs. That's why they're here. They somehow think that I know what I'm doing. But if you opened up my browser history, you'd have to wash your hands. But the thing you'd find the most often is Google. By far, just by far. I always feel, it says I would lose my job if it wasn't for Stack Overflow. Crap, he's on to us, be toll free. Yeah, it's like I always feel like, and I'm upfront with clients about it, when I give an answer that I know firsthand from experience, I'm like, this is the answer and I know it. When they ask me something, I'm like, okay, look, I don't know the answer to that. We're going to Google this together, and you're going to see what I see so that you know how I'm interpreting stuff. One of the, I went to your classes, I do know everything. So yeah, don't feel bad at all. The way that I would bring it up in an interview is I'd say, for example, one of the challenges that I've had is I had queries that were running slowly, and I successfully brought their runtime down from 30 seconds to 3 seconds. And those are the kinds of problems that I love to solve. But these days, really, everybody expects that you're Googling for the answers. So it's true. Like Richie says, remember when we had to read 5 volumes of manuals to learn? I had for quite a while the books for SQL Server 7, 6, and a couple others. Not because I ever read them, but because I had them in my bookshelf in the office. It's in a closet. I don't keep books out publicly or whatever, but not that I care if you saw them. It's just I don't access them very often. They were for sentimental reasons. And it was amazing. Adam says I still have those books in my office. It's amazing just to see those books and go, oh my gosh, we used to, and we thought that they were absolutely correct. In reality, they were being redacted all the time, like fixed, because they were so chock full of errors. It's funny how that worked. Control K, Control C says, is it safe to... So I have to say, I'm going to answer that because that's so funny, the Rocks books. Is it safe to drop all indexes that have a high percentage of writes versus reads? I'm going to give you an example. Say that you've got the CEO report, and your CEO only runs this report once a week, just once, but you want it to be blazing fast. In that case, you keep the index, because if you drop that index, the CEO thinks you're incompetent because her query sucks. So there are exceptions. The way that I solve those kinds of things is that when I create an index for the CEO report, I'll tend to name the index with the Jira issue or the help desk issue that caused me to create the index, so that way when I'm trying to remember why that index is still there, I can go back to that Jira issue and go see. So that helps a lot. To learn about which ones it's safe to drop, check out my Fundamentals of Index Tuning and Mastering Index Tuning courses, and I teach you a whole methodology for how you go about picking which ones to keep and which ones to sweep. Now there was one that I kind of laughed about with the Red Rocks books. So when I got the chance to co-author a book with somebody, a friend of mine, Christian Bolton, said, "Hey, are you interested in picking up a couple of chapters in a Rocks book?" I said, absolutely, I would totally love to. This is back, 2015, 10 years ago, 2008 internals and troubleshooting. And I said, what's the minimum number of chapters that I can write in order to have my picture on the cover with the rest of the authors? Because when I was growing up and looking at tech books, those Red Rocks books with the bad Photoshop of all the people across the front, and they're all in different lighting, and you can tell they're on different planets, and some of them are tiny and some of them are large. I'm like, one day I want my picture on that book. So I was so excited. They said, you write 2 chapters and you're going to have your face on the book. I'm like, deal. I wrote 2 chapters. They get ready to go to publishing, and our book was the first one where they removed the photos from the front. I was so pissed. We got a race car, which was kind of cool, but not the photo. And I was like, son of a... You don't make jack for money when you write technical books. I mean, you make nothing. It's below minimum wage. And the whole reason I wrote my 2 chapters was to have my picture on the front of a Rocks book. And then they pulled that out. I was like, sucks so bad. Yeah. Next up, Sachin says, we had a query running along with async network I.O. On a server that was ingesting data. How would that have helped? Async network I.O. means that the application is not responding quickly enough, that it isn't asking SQL Server for the next row. So if you give more power to that application, it's going to be able to digest the data faster and ask for the next row faster. Richie says, I still have the book. I threw mine away. I kept the Chinese translation for a while because I thought that was kind of cool. Itzasham says, why can't Microsoft better come up with a better IDE for SQL Server? Would you pay for it? How much would you pay for it? So what would be the number that you would pay for a better IDE? I wonder what that number is. Oh, you wouldn't pay. Oh, you thought it should be free. So why don't you build it? Why would Microsoft build it? Why don't you? Somebody's going to do free labor. Hell, 7:15 Pacific. You get done today. Get started. Get to cracking. Why are you screwing around watching YouTube channels? Go get to work. Well, what do you think? Microsoft's going to do that free work for you for no apparent reason? Now, if you're willing to pay money, there are other IDEs. No, he said a better IDE. He said a better IDE. So there are other third-party ones. JetBrains DataGrip is one example. It's a cross-platform IDE. I don't use it because I tend to just use the stuff that's built in because clients won't usually let me add stuff in or go install paid stuff. But that's basically why. If it's not going to make them any money, it just doesn't make sense that they would do it. It's not like it's going to give them more market share. You're using SQL Server regardless. Lynn says, what is the best way to move the master database to a different drive? The thing that I would probably do is shut down SQL Server, copy the master database from one place to another, and then during startup, you can specify with a startup parameter where the master files live, and then that way, when it starts up over on the other side, then you can do your alters to change the location to the new one and remove your startup parameters. There's a KB article on how to do it. If you search support.microsoft.com for that, there's a KB article that kind of lays the whole thing out, but that's the basic idea. Next up, Istisham says, is there any chance we can have a folder structure for tables, views, and stored procedures in Management Studio? It's a pain to scroll up and down. Oh my God, you have to scroll up and down? Oh my God. Oh, that must be terrible for you. Well, the alternative would be that you could read the documentation and see how it works. You won't do that, so I'll show you. So the way that it works is that when you go into SQL Server Management Studio and you go into things like programmability, if you come in here, you can right-click on stored procedures and you can click filter and then filter settings. And then look at what you have here. So then you can just pick for the things that you want instead of scrolling up and down like some kind of terribly unprivileged person. Oh my goodness, that must be just so hard for you. Next up, Hemed says, I'm such a terrible person. Are there any upcoming features in SQL Server? Nope, they're done. Completely done. They've shipped it. It's perfect the way that it is. Frankly, I don't understand why anyone would use any other product. It has every feature that you could possibly have inside of a database. Next up, Bandar says, does SQL Server issue a log flush during shutdown or failover? If yes, when will delayed durability be an issue? So delayed durability purposely tells SQL Server, I don't need to flush the log. You know, like you can do it whenever it's convenient for you. SQL Server does not flush it during a scheduled shutdown, a scheduled failover, or an unscheduled failover. So unfortunately, wah there. Next up, Richie says, how I use the first responder kit, I make Brent do it. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. Brent, how do I, and then it flows both ways too. I'll be like, when I write something in Postgres, I'll be like, Richie, I have this poorly written query that probably doesn't even compile. I've checked it into source control. Thank you. And then he has to go and fix it and build all kinds of unit tests. Willem says, I administer a piece of COTS software. COTS. I think that last one is a 4-letter word, but I'm not really sure. That uses both implicit transactions and RCSI. There's a lot of blocking. My statement is implicit. Do you know how I build a convincing demo? That's pretty far beyond the stretch of what I can answer here in a Q&A, unfortunately. That's pretty far beyond what I could answer here in a Q&A. Like building a demo, that I would just say, just go build it. If you believe that that's the case, then you should be able to go and build that. I actually don't agree with you. I think that you're probably wrong there. Next up, Control K, Control C says, why do we see text file group sometimes has no data? Developer use something. That's another one where I can't really answer on a chat. I really should start reading these before I put them up on the screen. I have no idea. What you probably want to do is go paste something like that over at dba.stackexchange.com. Let's see. Oh, Francis says over on YouTube, how often do you deal with CX packet issues in the real world? All the time. All the time. All the time. I have a vent that's coming unscrewed up in my office. All the time, totally all the time. And that's why we spend about 2 hours on it altogether in the Mastering Server Tuning class in Mastering Server Tuning. Sebastian says, will you continue office hours when moving to Iceland? I'm not sure. I'm not even sure that I'll continue it beyond like December. I just do it when I have free time, when it works out for my schedule. I don't always do it because very often I don't have free time. And also I don't always want to go. I have a vent screw loose. Next up over on YouTube, Javier says, do you recommend taking a couple of exams? It depends on what your goal is. If your goal is to stand out amongst the people in a stack of resumes, then it doesn't really hurt. But I've never seen someone go, oh, thank God I had that exam, or else I never would have met my wife or whatever. They're not that good. They're pretty crappy. Over on YouTube, Ariel says, hi, Brent. I have a couple of couple databases that have average read stock. Oh, it's like stalkers. Over 2,000 milliseconds. What's the best way to handle it? It's funny, I have a whole class on that when we talk about in Mastering Server Tuning. I'm going to give you a written rundown of a short list, though. So the written rundown on how to solve slow storage. So, and this is prioritized in order. Number 1, tune indexes. Number 2, tune queries. 3, add memory. 4, tune storage. The reason why they're in that list is that managers kind of see your time as free. They think that anything that you're going to do is essentially free, doesn't cost you anything. So index tuning helps you make a whole lot of queries faster, quickly. Tuning queries is a little bit more resource intensive. So I keep a half-hour hourglass on my desk just as kind of a reminder that whenever I pop open a query plan and I have to go tune it, I usually have to flip this this at least once, if not several times, per query. Now that's going to take a whole lot more time, whereas when you tune indexes, you can make just a few changes in half an hour and make lots of queries go faster. Number 3, adding memory. Just because memory covers so many sins in terms of storage, if the data that you want is cached up in RAM, it doesn't matter as much how slow the storage is. And then tuning storage is the last one, in the sense that it's extremely expensive and it takes a lot of resources. Usually it requires downtime and changes at the system level, so it's just like the last regret or last source. Next up, Takvim says, I've recently been told by a SQL expert that stored procedures are bad. This can't be true. Tell me it's not true. So he wasn't just talking about stored procedures in general. He was talking about your stored procedures. Your stored procedures are terrible. Oh my God, they're awful. I want to just like rinse myself in Lysol after I see your stored procedures. They're gross. Why are you calling a web service? Why would you think that you should be generating emoji art inside your stored procedures? That doesn't even make sense. Why would you shell out to DOS? I mean, it's terrible. Did you really need to put in a cursor inside a cursor inside a cursor? You've got to stop. It's your stored procedures he was talking about. Johnette says, hey, Brent. Hey, for someone who's new on development, could you please explain indexing? I feel like I don't understand it. Yes, search for Brent Ozar, How to Think Like the Engine. Brent Ozar, How to Think Like the Engine, and I have a whole totally free course that explains indexing using pieces of paper. So it's available via YouTube videos, via blog posts if you prefer a written version. So that's Brent Ozar, How to Think Like the Engine. Shtal says, which language is the most important? Please tell me once. English. Next up, Lorad says, is Crystal Disk Mark a clean install? Had some funky malware show up in past versions. So you don't actually have to install it. They have a zip installer or a zip download where it just sits in a folder. And then the way that I usually use that is I just download the zip version, stick it on a network share that all my servers can access, and then I just run it from there. Next up, Control K, Control C says, do you have any forecast for when and where SQL Server will reach its end of life? Last time Microsoft talked publicly about revenue numbers was, I think, like a year or two ago, and it was $1 billion a year. If you were making $1 billion a year, would you be in a hurry to end that product's life? Me neither. Yeah, no. So I don't think it's coming anytime soon. Venkat says, good morning again. Question number 2. Garvit, we're not going to ask the same question multiple times. I'll go ahead and just remove you from the chat there. May I know what's the difference between CX packet weight types and CX consumer weight types? May I also knowing I can purchase your courses from India? Absolutely you can, yes. And I cover that inside my Mastering Server Tuning class. In Mastering Server Tuning, I show you demos with the differences between the two. We have like an hour on normal parallelism situations and an hour on abnormal parallelism situations. So that one's in Mastering Server Tuning. Next up, let's see here. Nero says over on YouTube, table valued functions versus stored procedures, pros and cons, and what do you recommend? If you're going to write something with multiple statements in it, like go declare something, go select something, insert something. If you're going to have multiple statements in it, you want it in a stored procedure, because a table valued function, if it has multiple statements in it, has all kinds of huge performance problems. There are some edge cases where table valued functions make sense, like if you need to join to them and they only have one statement in them, but that's it. Next up, let's see here. Beth says, what's the alternative method to check replication status besides Management Studio? Third-party monitoring tools, definitely. Whether you get Quest Spotlight, Idera SQL DM, SentryOne SQL Sentry, Redgate SQL Monitor, any of those all have monitoring built in and can tell you when replication breaks and can reach out to you proactively, like email you when that stuff breaks. I would totally do that in a heartbeat. Ralph says, how can I use SQL Blogs XML file, which is published in your GitHub? I wasn't able to subscribe to those blogs. So if you don't know what an OPML file is, you probably don't want to do that. Click on the Feedly collection link instead. So if you go... For those of you who know about, well, let's see, Brent, Ozar, GitHub, on my GitHub page, I have a repo with the blogs that I subscribe to. So if you go over to SQL Blogs, there's the OPML file. If you don't have a tool that uses OPML files, then just click here where it says also available as a Feedly collection. And Feedly has totally free options so that then you can just consume the same blog post that I do there. Next up. Also, I should give a quick round of shout out of applause to SurlyDev, our moderator, who heroically copies and pastes questions back and forth between YouTube and makes sure that everybody is being polite inside here and ejects people who are nasty and puts in helpful links too as well. So big round of applause for SurlyDev, our moderator. Thank you, sir. Next up, Hassan says, what happened if I use SQL Server Linux and Docker and I don't pay anything for the license? If it's Developer Edition, you don't have to. Developer Edition's totally free. Now, if you try to run production services on there, then you're going to be in trouble. Then what happens is that one day, as you're sitting inside your office, just thinking about the things that you would rather be doing, you're going to hear a polite knock on the door. You're going to think that it's an edible arrangement. That's not going to be what it is. You will be the edible arrangement. Next up, Control K, Control C says, is it a good idea to put high read and write tables on separate file groups? Does it help reduce schema locks? No. Does it reduce PFS contention? That's not really where you want to go for that. The place where it helps make things better is if you're on a virtual machine. VMs usually need multiple virtual SCSI adapters with different volumes on each one, with different paths to each one. That can get you some edge case performance improvements. Or not even edge case, but mainstream performance improvements. But when you say new structures with billions of rows created on an hourly basis, I think we have a bigger problem. Like, that's billions of rows per hour. That's fairly high and fairly unusual to see in SQL Server. If that's exactly the kind of thing that I do in my consulting work, but I would just say that that's not the kind of thing where you're going to find free advice out on the web for, because billions of rows per hour is a really big deal. Next thing up, AV Gamer says, what are the two authentication modes in SQL Server? I think you're just like trying to play an interview question on me here. So it's Windows authentication or mixed mode. Windows authentication lets you only log in with Windows Auth. Mixed mode lets you either use Windows authentication or SQL logins. SQL logins for a while looked like they were going to be deprecated, but when the cloud came out and Microsoft realized that they didn't have any domain controllers in the cloud, SQL logins were the only answer. So no deprecation there. Lieven says over on YouTube, what's your opinion on ORM mappers and how do you handle questions about it from developers? I love them. I think ORMs are awesome. So Dapper, Entity Framework, and Hibernate, I think they're fantastic because they let developers quickly ship things. They let people quickly get application stuff out the door. Whereas if you had to write T-SQL for every time you needed to touch a database, the development would take way longer. Applications would be much more expensive to build. I know there are a lot of crotchety database administrators who are like, everyone should learn SQL, but at the same time you ask them what languages they know and they're like, only SQL? Why? I'm like, well, that doesn't really work very well. So I'm love ORMs. I'm a huge fan. There are crappy ORMs. Just make sure that the ORMs that you use have at least 1 million users. Don't go build Bob's ORM from Kentucky or whatever. Use an ORM that's fairly mainstream that a lot of other people use, because then that way you will tend to get lots of improvements to it. We answered that one already, so I should close that. Selimit says, good morning, Brant. They're all good questions, Brant. Says, how do we select from 2 tables from 2 servers? Generally, you would want to connect to the server that has the data you want. Just go connect to it. So if you have an application that needs things from 2 servers, go connect to those 2 SQL servers. There are I love Kentucky. I grew up in Kentucky, so I absolutely love it. So there are alternatives around that involving things like linked servers. The performance is pretty bad, though. The good advice is, if you want your query to perform, connect to the server that has the data that you want. AV Gamer asks, AV Gamer, oh, you're just playing around with asking me random interview questions. So I will tell you, instead of asking me random interview questions, why don't you go ahead and go back to AV Gaming? Have some fun there. Next up, let's see here. Oh, we'll get some strange questions. I'll delete a few of those. Delete that one. Interesting. Mark asks, is it okay to run CheckDB on the clustered indexes only in order to save time? The problem, it's pretty funny, Simon. The problem with that is, say that corruption is striking, you need to know as quickly as possible. You need to find out, because once corruption starts striking, you're on bad storage or a bad version of SQL Server or a corrupted build of Windows, whatever. So for me, if you want to make CheckDB go faster, the thing that I would do is with physical only. The physical only one lets you read every 8K page very quickly and just check the checksums on them. And then on the weekends, do with extended logical checks. Next up, Teja says, I want to drop some additional indexes, but I'm worried that I'll lose stats. Eventually, if I do lose the stats, they'll eventually be recreated by SQL Server, right? Yeah, absolutely. Don't worry about stats. You'll automatically get stats even the first time that someone queries a column. I like that you're being paranoid about that. That's good, but thankfully SQL Server automatically takes care of you on that one, which is kind of cool. Scott asks, at what point do you consider migrating away from SQL Server due to large database size issues? And what other products do you consider when reaching this point? So when it's like, why buy underpants when you can make them out of napkins, right? I'd love to see your closet. If your application has become really large, it's not just about database size, it's also about how much code you've written. And by the time that a database gets to 50 terabytes, 100 terabytes in size, there's usually so much code inside the enterprise that you couldn't just rapidly change to something else. What I do is I run SP Blitz index sorted by object size, and almost always, it's unbelievable how often this happens, there are a bunch of objects that shouldn't be in SQL Server. Click logs, XML logs, images. There'll be specific tables where I'd say, okay, if we get this one table out, it's going to cut 1/3 of the database size, which is going to make our backups quicker, restores, all that kind of thing, disaster recovery. So I'll put specific tables out. That's the way that I approach it, because it's unreal how often there's a very specific table that just shouldn't have been in a relational database to begin with. And it's easy to isolate that one product or that one table and move it out. Next up, Sundaramurthy, I apologize for my pronunciation, says, does using dynamic SQL in a stored procedure resolve parameter sniffing issues? I love where you're going, but no. And I talk about why not in my mastering parameter sniffing class. So it's a great, great question, but a mastering parameter sniffing, I show you demos of why it doesn't. Lorad says, I hope this isn't a farewell tour. You're at least selling t-shirts. No, I mean, I'll always do streams. It's just that my scheduling will change all the time. Like the scheduling on this, the entire scheduling of how why I do what I do here is that I tend to wake up around 2, 3, 4 in the morning. And On weekends, I don't have an urgent client thing that I need to do, or I'm not usually teaching training classes, and my wife doesn't usually wake up until around 8:30 or 9. So I have this like 6 a.m. to 6 a.m. to 8 a.m. Pacific window where I'm not really like futzing around and doing R&D. So I was like, well, I'll let you watch in on the stuff that I do. But I forgot how much y'all love asking questions. So it ended up working out that way. I definitely don't have plans to drop doing it. I just will shift the schedule around depending on where I live and what my schedule looks like. I also don't know what my sleep schedule is going to look like in Iceland. When we're there in the summer, it's the close to 18, 20, 23 hours worth of daylight. So it's really going to switch things around inside there. Kanim, I'm not quite sure what you're doing there. I'll go ahead and remove you from the group. Sashin says, we have a column of XML data type. How does SQL Server handle searches on that column? Poorly. Is it worth to have column stats on it? No, not at all. It doesn't help you at all there. Next up, Techveen says, did you know that Azure SQL DB comes with RCSI on by default? Yes, and you can't turn it off, if I remember correctly. I think it's great. I'm a huge fan of it. Fiker says, hi Brent, around when will you start the live class after the Black Friday sale? When you buy, you actually get a link to my calendar, and you can see my classes are scheduled out for like the next 6 months, so you can go in and see them. And I do them all the time, so. Drop table employee says, come for the SQL Server Q&A and stay for the sick burns. And I haven't done that many burns today. It's been kind of quiet and polite here too. Next up, let's see here. Oh, wow. Oh, we're coming down on a low number, which is actually kind of good. Let's see here. Ashish says, we have 200 databases on one server. Currently, we have all the MDFs on one drive. When running SP Blitz first, it stated a few MDFs are slow. Do you think it'll help moving them to different drives instead of keeping on one? Oh, it's a really good question. I bet you're on a VM. I bet you're on a virtual machine. Depending on your underlying storage, it can help to set up multiple virtual SCSI adapters and spreading that workload across different volumes that use different virtual SCSI adapters. It's a lot of work, but talk to your SAN administrator on how your SAN is configured and whether you need multiple virtual SCSI adapters. That's the place where it would help. If you don't make that change, multiple volumes will make no difference. Control K, Control C says, oh, I may need to rephrase my last question. Do you think there's any threat from new platforms databases for SQL Server to lose its market and then Microsoft to discontinue SQL Server? I don't think so. Like, I don't think it would be for quite a while. After all, look at y'all here. This is a SQL Server Q&A, and there are usually hundreds of people inside these. Like, I think there was 250 people in yesterday. It's pretty robust as a product. And whenever I do polls inside of my training classes, you'll hear Microsoft talking Azure continuously in their marketing, but when you poll the actual community, very few folks are using Azure SQL DB as their primary database. It's there, people are using it, but it's not the primary. And it's the same thing with like all the buzz about Postgres, Aurora, MySQL, all these other platforms. They have a lot of buzz, but it's not like it's really has significantly eroded SQL Server's market share. So I wouldn't see that coming anytime quite soon. Let's see here, delete a couple of other ones. Let's see, the Mad Hammer, good to see you again, says, I have a stored proc that runs fine 99% of the time. Oh, you asked this yesterday, and that's parameter sniffing. I said it's parameter sniffing. I have 2 classes on it, fundamentals of parameter sniffing and mastering parameter sniffing. Go watch those classes. MRT says, any favorite adult beverages you will miss in Iceland? Tequila. We love tequila, and we love very specific brands of tequila, like Clase Azul, that are almost impossible to get in Iceland. They're hard to get in the United States. So we're going to miss that. I'm not worried about buying it and importing it or anything. Instead, I'm switching over to gin. Like, I really enjoy gin and tonics in Iceland. They're really focused on gin and tonics over there. So I'm looking forward to it. Every time I go over, I just love gin and tonics. So that's pretty good. Wines, I'm going to bet that the wine selection is going to be way the hell more expensive because everything's imported. Whereas here in California, we have an insane selection of wines, red wines, white wines, all kinds of stuff that are really inexpensive. So Bandar says, is every DBA an alcoholic? Well, when you see what we have to do, it kind of makes sense. Nero says, what are the drawbacks that you see in user-defined table types? Is there a better way to parameterize a set of records at once? Yeah, temp tables. Create a temp table, put in all the data that you need, and then call the stored procedure with the existence of that temp table already created. That's a way better way to accomplish that goal. The problem with user-defined table types is just that they don't tend to, SQL Server doesn't accurately estimate how many rows are in them and what the data distribution is of that rows. So when you join to them, you tend to get pretty crappy execution plans. If you have to use them, the common approach to do is as soon as your stored procedure starts, immediately create a temp table, dump the contents of that table valued parameter into it, and then you'll get better execution plans through the rest of the stored procedures. Tokens are too low though, Sherman. The problem is that they're real low off the ground, and it's not like we were in a Land Cruiser the last time that we were there, and we needed like a foot of ground clearance. So we're looking at, as soon as Land Rover brings out the Defender 90s, the two-door Defenders, we're going to buy one of those over in Iceland. And we're importing Helmut. We'll bring him over for a fun summer car, but it's only going to be good for the summer. But a Taken is totally, doesn't make any sense over there. Rahul says, hey Brent, is there any way to, hey, Technics Optics, please stop asking that same question over and over again. You just ask the question once, and then that's it. And I'll block you again. You tried to change your name, but off you go. Rahul says, is there any way to differentiate backup preferences in an AG? Yes. If you hit the documentation on that, the question kind of tells me that you haven't read the documentation. It's really pretty easy. So go read the documentation on that one. Next one's a little more challenging here. So Alejandro asks, do you think we'll ever see multi-replica writes for availability groups? So the thing that Oracle touts with that is Oracle RAC. Oracle RAC essentially has that. And whenever I've been around people at Microsoft and an Oracle customer has come up and said, do y'all have anything like RAC? I need to be able to write to multiple servers at the same time. The Microsoft people have a very nice way of approaching that. They say, oh, do you use RAC today? No. Why not? It's really expensive. It's like $1 million. I'm like, well, okay, so so you're asking for a capability that you actually can't afford to use and you don't use anyway, so that's why you don't get that. Microsoft would put it in if it would bring people over from Oracle, but from every time that I've ever heard that conversation, the answer's been no. So next up, let's see here. Oh, so what asks, how can we find which query causes latency in our always on availability group if the problem is some query? Oh, I'll show you. So the place to start is go run, come over here, SP Blitz cache sort order equals writes. Run SP Blitz cache sort order equals writes. And then that will sort the stuff that's in your plan cache by the queries that have been writing the most data. That's typically the first place that I'll go and look, because people will be surprised at the queries that have been writing so much data out. It's often like an ETL job that's just dumping scratch data to disk all the time. If you want to learn more about how I use that, I have a How I Use the First Responder Kit class coming up this week, and it's on sale. So if you go to brentozar.com/Black Friday, I have all kinds of packages where you can attend all my live classes for like a year or two straight. And the cool thing about my live classes is that the attendees are really smart and they ask good questions. Unlike that other person in YouTube, you know the one I'm talking about. It's a waste of time. Next up, I'm such a terrible person. Next up, MRTCS says, I wish I could have attended a SQL cruise with you back when that was a thing. It was so much fun. I had just an absolute blast doing that. I really loved doing that. My friend asks, coffee shop at 8. Yes, indeed. My coffee shop downstairs opens. I got kind of good news recently. They said that they're going to start opening at 7 a.m. But then when I talk to them, they're like, well, yeah, we're only doing coffee at 7 a.m. We're not actually opening the kitchen at 7 a.m. So I'm like, oh, man. So I still have to wait until 8 a.m. before I can go down and get my food. So, Next up, our LORAD says our legacy database code uses table variables. I'm looking for a good reason not to replace every one of them. Should I start replacing my table variables with reckless abandon? If you're not on SQL Server 2019 yet, yes, I would check the timeline in when you're going to be on 2019. If you're going to be on 2019 in the next year, maybe 2 years, I would probably hold off. Otherwise, if you're going to be on like 2016, 2017 for the foreseeable future, then I would start ripping them out. Technics Optics asked like 15, 16 times, how do you import Excel sheets into tables into a database? Oh, it's a great question. Here, I'll show you. So what you do is you open up a web browser and you go to Google and you say how to import a spreadsheet into SQL Server. And then when you hit that, there's this thing there called the documentation. Unbelievable. And if you can't read words that large, there's also Stack Overflow. And they give you step-by-step instructions. And I've got great news. It's free. You don't even have to pay for it. Isn't that amazing? So you may not have seen this before. Google, it's Google. And then you can ask questions. It's really, really good stuff. That's google.com. Company's even doing fairly well, I hear. It's because so many people need to use that kind of thing. Next up, Sashin says, our SQL servers are hosted on Amazon. We do volume snapshots every hour. We never run CheckDB. Do I need to be worried? Hell yes, you need to be worried. SQL Server itself has bugs in it that will knowingly write trash data out to disk. It actually writes trash data out to disk. And if you go to restore from the snapshot, the data on the snapshot's still screwed. It's not like it's going to help you at all there. So definitely, yes, hell yes, run CheckDB. Let's see here. Next up, Eric says over on YouTube, greetings and salutations. My friend was wondering if his information on TempDB being sharply limited on Azure Hyperscale. Yeah, so with all of Microsoft's products, the storage is rate limited. And that doesn't matter whether you're talking about TempDB or user databases. So it absolutely is a real thing. And you don't get a lot of choices on how TempDB is set up on things like Hyperscale. I love the idea Hyperscale. It's really cool. I've written the blog posts about how the mechanics of it work. I love the idea of it, but Hyperscale is just kind of such an odd name for it when the throughput is slower than a USB thumb drive. So I'm kind of like, it's a good idea, but we're not quite there yet. I think it's got a future. It's got legs to it. It's just not quite there yet today. DB says, how important is the data type and data size to tuning queries? You know, in the grand scheme of things, it's not really important, but it is important. And the reason why it's important is that SQL Server bases the size of its memory grants off of the size of your data types. So if you do like varchar 500 for every single column, then SQL Server will think it's all half full and it's going to end up generating giant memory grants. It's the kind of problem that you only see at scale. You don't see it when you're like running applications on your desktop kind of thing, but when you start to see it at scale, it starts to become a problem. MRTS, Mr. T says, that's what I'm going to call you Mr. T because I kind of like it. Brent must be getting hungry. The burns are coming more frequently. It's true. You know what else happens though? This is absolutely true. Is that the longer that I stream, the view counts go up, the number of people who watch goes up, and YouTube and Twitch start recommending me to the public, and then the question quality starts to go down. And that's when you'll notice all of a sudden, if I get promoted on a homepage or something, you'll notice that all of a sudden it's like, what is a database? Where is my printer? How come my antivirus doesn't work? You know, I start getting the really herpaderp questions, so it's kind of funny to see how that works. Next up, Compile Nick says, Have you ever seen clients using temporal tables, and what are good example or good use cases? I think I've only had one or two clients using it. The classic example is data warehouses in a dimension table when you want to track every change to that dimension, but you don't want to roll your own slowly changing dimension table. I think it looks beautiful. I really like the looks of it. Seems like a neatly architected feature. I just wish that you could put your own date stamp on rows as you import them, because it kinds of, Momji says, or Blaze says it's awful. The problem with it is if I have to go back and reload a dimension, it inherits the date times as of right now, not the date times that I want to put the dimension in as. So it requires a little bit more work if you want to have your own dates and times used for the temporal stuff. Let's see here. Jayutha says, using profile or extended events better to detect deadlocks? Neither. SP Blitz lock. SP Blitz lock is a stored procedure originally written by Eric Darling, a brilliant fella out of Brooklyn, and it's so easy. It makes dealing with deadlocks just a piece of cake. That's SP Blitz lock, and I demo that in Wednesday's class, how I use the first responder kit. So you can sign up for that class. It's like $50 if I remember right, somewhere inside there. Oh yeah, he's on Twitch too. Oh, I haven't seen him streaming in a while. He's at home. He lives in Brooklyn. There's not a lot of space. Doesn't have a dedicated home office. So I'm really looking forward to when, if he moves out, he's talking about moving to another place and getting a bigger office. I'm really excited to see him stream more often. Ben, I answered that one already. Rumi, oh man, what is the best practice to change database collation? It sucks so bad. You have to export your data into another table that has the collation that you want. It sucks so bad. There's not an easy way to go about doing it. It's easy to change the database's collation, but all your existing data with its own collation, that's the part that really sucks. And I don't know what the best practice would be for it other than to just dump all your data back out and bring it all back in with different data types. All right, I'm going to do one last question and then that's it. Control K, Control C says probably my last question, so that fits out very well. Does using trace flag 6610 help reduce log growth caused by bulk inserts? Is there a better solution? I don't know that trace flag off the top of my head, but I'm going to give you two things that I would go look at. So if you search for K-Taranov trace flag, there's this guy, K. Taranov, who has a repository of all the trace flags that are out there and what their uses are. Really slick. It's open in GitHub, and you can go search for stuff inside here. So I'm going to go into here and hit 610. I'll do a Control F for 610. And then there you go. So it's got links with the documentation and all that for trace flag 610. So that's K. Taranov and then trace flag. The other thing that I would look at is the SQL Server Data Loading Performance Guide. Now this hasn't been updated in like a decade, but it still has a lot of good starting points as how to get minimal logging when you're dealing with things like bulk inserts. It's early enough that you really need to go check the clips page out. I am totally going to do that today because I think it was such a neat thing there. I love that you were doing that. All right, so that is everything for today. Thanks a lot for hanging out with me this Sunday morning. I'm going to go off and go get me some lox and bagel now from the coffee shop downstairs. Next week, what have I got going next week? I don't know if I'm doing, this is Thanksgiving weekend. I don't know if I'm going to stream over Thanksgiving weekend. It's not like I'm going anywhere. It's not like I'm doing anything in specific, but we'll see how it goes. So thanks everyone for hanging out with me, and I will see y'all next time. Adios.